In the popular high school movie Mean Girls, Katie, who's played by Lindsay Lohan, learns quickly that in order for her to fit in with the popular plastics in school, she'll need to adopt their language. So she starts using words like fetch, fugly, word vomit, which aren't typically words that she uses in her everyday language. Now, the movie captures the role of affiliation in adapting speech styles that match that of others in order to define and maintain the status in the in-groups. And affiliation is something that we do every single day without even realizing it. It's the tendency or the desire to be with people that are like us. In doing so, affiliation is changing how we speak in order to gain acceptance and attempt to fit in with the people that we're conversing with. But this principle isn't only with convergence, it also works in reverse too. People who want to set themselves apart adopt strategies of divergence or speaking in a way that will put them and set them apart from other people. This process is done in adolescence into adulthood and ranges in a variety of groups, ranging anywhere from street gangs all the way to military personnel. Throughout the semester, we have researched multiple sources and we have surveyed a variety of people to find out how they adapt their language to reflect the groups that they belong to. Today we're going to discuss what affiliation is and how we adapt our language to reflect the groups that we are in, and if we notice affiliation amongst ourselves and also amongst others in their mannerisms. So we're going to turn the time over to Ivan, and he will help us to understand what affiliation is and by defining that a little bit more for us. Thanks.
So what is affiliation? The dictionary defines affiliation as a state of being affiliated or associated. You can be affiliated with many different things such as political parties, religious organizations, or social groups. We'll be discussing the effect of affiliation on our communication. When you're communicating with someone, you might change your speech patterns to affiliate yourself with someone or distinguish yourself from someone else. This process is known as speech accommodation. There are many different parts of your speech you can change. Some examples are your vocabulary. Depending on who you're talking about, you might be more crass, or you might have a more respectful vocabulary. Rate of speech can change. The level of politeness can change. So why do people change their speech? As I talked about, it's either to set themselves apart or associate themselves with someone. The process of changing your speech to be similar to someone else's is known as convergence. People usually do convergence to gain favor with others, such as bosses, co-workers, friends, romantic interests. In the book it talks about a study where workers would change even their swearing patterns to gain favor with their bosses. Divergence is the process of changing your speech to be different from those around you. An example of this might be how different generations use different slang so that they're not the same as their parents or such. Now that we know a little bit more about affiliation, I'm going to hand it over to Avery so she can talk about the survey we conducted on affiliation.
Now that we learned a little bit more about affiliation, now we're going to talk about the survey we conducted. We conducted a survey with 8 questions about affiliation, and we went around and asked a bunch of people to take the survey. 126 applicants answered our survey, and one of the questions that was on the survey was, do you find yourself using slang or changing your speech mannerisms to feel included in a group? And 50% of people sometimes found themselves using slang or changing speech mannerisms to fit in, and 25% never found themselves using it. 26% often or always found themselves using slang to fit in with the group. Personally, I feel like I change my slang or speech mannerism mostly when I'm like with my team or like really close friends, and like they use slang that I usually don't use, but find myself using it without even trying. The second question that was on our survey was, do you find yourself using vocabulary or speech mannerisms different from your normal patterns when you're setting yourself apart from a group? And 55% sometimes found themselves using or changing their speech mannerisms to set themselves apart, and 31% never found themselves doing this, and 13% always or often. I think that the 31% that never found themselves setting themselves apart, they just don't notice that they're doing it, even though they probably do. They just don't notice it themselves. And I find myself doing this sometimes when like I talk different around my friends and teammates than I do, say, my parents or classmates. And now I'm going to turn the time over to Danielle.
Next, I'd like to talk about how we see affiliation in others. My group and I surveyed 125 people and asked them how they saw others change their language, personality, or mannerisms when involved in different groups. As you can see, most of our responders replied with at least sometimes seeing affiliation in others. I have personally seen affiliation in others in 3 different ways. We adapt our speech according to those that we care about, as it mentions in our book. The first way I've seen it is being introduced into new groups. My friends, whenever I would introduce them to my parents, they would put on a more respectful attitude and become more polite, and they were less likely to use slang words that we would use amongst our peers. The next way that I've seen people adjust when introduced to different friend groups or mixing genders is when a cute boy would introduce himself to my friend group. My girlfriends would reposition themselves to view the person of interest and become more touchy, smile more, and change their tone of voice. Aside from the physical changes, my friends would also change their point of topic to better relate with the boy that was sitting at our table, and that would include switching from talking about cheerleading and shopping to fishing trips and football. Lastly, I have seen affiliation in others in a professional setting at my work. I work in an office, but I have a really good relationship with my boss. We're really close, and it's pretty laid back, but I have seen him switch from being really angry at an employee. When a customer walks in, that attitude completely changes, goes away, and he becomes calm, cool, and collect for the customer in order to gain his favoritism. Lastly, I have seen affiliation professionally in others when I get an email. The vocabulary used in that email is different from a group message, even if the group message does have to do with work. It's more laid back, and I think this is because my boss doesn't necessarily care how he is presented to his coworkers, but he cares how he's presented to customers. And now I'd like to turn it over to Shanna to talk about how we see affiliation in mediated communication.
So we've been talking about affiliation in face-to-face conversations, but now we'll be talking about it in mediated communication. Our textbook, Looking In, Looking Out, says, mediated communication refers to all the channels that connect people through some electronic medium rather than via face-to-face interaction. Mediated communication is similar to the face-to-face variety in that the goals are the same, as are most of the processes and principles. So if the processes and principles are the same in face-to-face and mediated, it would stand to reason that affiliation is in mediated communication as well. In our survey, we decided to test this out, and we found that 37% answered always or often, and an additional 37% answered sometimes. So that's about 75% who recognize that we do use affiliation through mediated communication. Our survey was backed by an official study done in 2012 in the UK by Fullwood, Orchard, and Floyd about emoticon convergence in internet chat rooms. So they found two things relating to affiliation in their study. One was about gender, one was about age. So we'll talk about gender first. It says, irrespective of the gender of the contributor in discussion groups, typically feminine styles of communication occurred in female-dominant groups, and typically masculine styles of communication persisted in male-dominated groups. This is a classic example of affiliation, and it was used in how they used emojis in their communications. Next, age. Emojis are typically viewed as a younger generation thing, and so older people will often use emojis trying to fit in with the younger generation. Or they might not use emojis or use them differently to set themselves apart from the younger generation. So this is an example of convergence or divergence, whether they want to fit in or stand apart. So now we've seen through our study and through this official study that we do use affiliation in our mediated communication, especially through emojis.
So as we've talked about affiliation, the change in speech and mannerisms to fit in to groups or environments, as we can see that there's different types of affiliation. Face-to-face, talking to them, physically being in the environment, using social media such as using emojis, not using emojis, tweeting, texting, using filters. We can also see affiliation in others when we watch them affiliate with certain groups or even over social media. We did a survey and it said that 75% of people noticed affiliation in themselves at one point or another, but it also said 99% of people noticed affiliation when others were using it. So affiliation is in our day-to-day lives, whether we're using it or noticing it in others. But it actually can have some negative effects if we don't choose to use it right. We have to be careful. Using a couple of examples being using a term that belongs to a certain culture or racial group. When you're not in that group, it could possibly offend. So you're not really you're not fitting in. You're really just kind of doing the opposite of your goal. Another more lighthearted example would be parents and teenagers. Parents using certain slangs to fit in with the teenagers. Sometimes it may work, but most of the time it kind of creates a more awkward situation. So you just have to be aware of what message you're trying to portray. So affiliation, it helps us fit in, it helps us stand out, and when we use it appropriately, it allows us to create pathways to get to know, learn about, and build relationships with a wide variety of people.